I'm Francis Levy, co-director of the Philoctetes Center, and welcome to Eye of the Beholder. Now I'm proud to introduce Dr. Edward Nersessian. Edward Nersessian is clinical professor of psychiatry at Cornell Weill, founding editor of the Journal of Neuroanalysis, and co-director of the Philoctetes Center. Dr. Nersessian will moderate this afternoon's panel and introduce our other distinguished panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. I will introduce the panelists in an anti-clockwise way. So I will start with David Freedberg, who is professor of art history at Columbia University and director of the Italian Academy for Advanced Studies in America. Barbara Stafford is William B. Ogden Distinguished Service Professor of Art History at the University of Chicago. Vittorio Gallese is Associate Professor of Human Physiology at the University of Parma, where he teaches cardiovascular physiology and neurophysiology in the School of Medicine. Suzanne Anker is a visual artist and theoretician working with genetic imagery. And Francis Baudry is a training and supervising analyst at the New York Psychoanalytic Society and Institute. What I've told the panelists today, the participants in the round table, is that what we would like to have is a conversation between them, which will take place for about an hour and 15 minutes, and then we will open up for questions from the audience. And to orient people, I've asked Vittorio Gallese to first say a few words about what motor neurons are, and then David Freedberg to say why he thinks they have any relevance to art. And then we will have everybody participate. Vittorio.
Good evening to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, we discovered mirror neurons during the July of 1991. We weren't looking for them. We weren't aware of their existence. We were nevertheless investigating the relationship between action and perception in the macaque monkey brain. We had already discovered neurons that discharge fire every time the monkey is involved in grasping motor acts, grasping objects. And the same neuron would fire also when the monkey is passively inspecting the same object. So this kind of neurons translate the shape and size of an object into the motor program required to interact with that object. So we were grasping different objects at hand in the lab in order to present them to the monkey so that the monkey could look at them. And we realized that the timing of the discharge of the neurons were quite odd. So the neuron fired not when we were presenting the object to the monkey, but immediately before, while we were grasping the object in order to present it to the monkey. And at the beginning, it looked really odd. I mean, we didn't expect it, and we thought maybe an artifact, maybe the monkey is moving, we don't see that. So we made a series of experiments to, at first, falsify the possible interpretation that the neuron were indeed responding to the observation of an action performed by someone else. All these control experiments gave negative results. Then we realized that we discovered something new, and to be honest, we were from the very beginning fully aware of the possible implication of this discovery. Then the next step was to see whether such a mirroring mechanism could be detected also in the human brain. So we started first with the experiment using transcranial magnetic stimulation. So you excite a part of the motor cortex by delivering a magnetic stimulus on top of the motor cortex. So according to where you place the coil, you may be capable of exciting, for example, the motor neuron, which excite the muscle of your hand. And we realized that when participants were observing the action of someone else, their motor cortex was getting a facilitatory effect. Then, after this evidence, the next step consisted in pinning down this mirror neuron system by means of brain imaging technologies. So we started first with the PET, positron emission tomography, which is a quite invasive method. Luckily enough, immediately afterwards we could shift to fMRI, which is a non-invasive method. And the outcome of these experiments was that yes, we do have a mirroring mechanism in our motor system, and the location of the system is quite homologous to that disclosed in the macaque monkey brain. So part of the premotor cortex and the posterior parietal cortex are activated not only when we perform action, but also when we observe the actions done by someone else. Then we extended our investigation to other domains like emotions and sensations. So in one study that we published in Neuron in 2003, we were able to show that there is a region within the frontal lobe. This part of the frontal lobe is called the insula. And it's a part of our brain which relays the analysis of sensory stimuli with the autonomic reactions to those stimuli. Well, this part of the insula is activated when people perceive disgust in the facial expression of someone else, but also when they subjectively feel disgust. So again, we have another instantiation of a mirroring mechanism. The same part of my brain which is active when I have a first-person experience of a given emotion is also activated when I have when I am witnessing the same emotion as experienced by someone else. Then another step consisted in investigating what we may wish to call tactile empathy. When our body is touched, there are regions in our brain that are mapping where this tactile sensation occurs. And it is just because of these sensory areas that we are capable to localize, for example, a tactile stimulus. So the question was, do these areas which are activated when a part of my body is being touched, will they also respond when we see an equivalent part of the body of someone else being touched? And the answer was yes, was positive. And this result has been replicated 1 year after by the group of Chris Friet at UCL, University College London. And they further extended the result. They brain scanned a synesthetic patient, a patient that not only knows how does it feel to be caressed, but literally feels on her body the physical sensation experienced by the person she is looking at. And in this particular patient, this mirroring mechanism turned out to be hyperactivated. So this, in a nutshell, is what mirror neurons are about, a part of the story at the very least.
Thank you. David Freedberg.
Well, I think Dr. Nersessian asked me to talk a little bit about why I found the discovery of mirror neurons by Vittorio Gallese and his colleagues at Parma so important for art historians. So this is what I'm going to do. I, a long time ago, already in the late 1960s, had become very interested in the phenomenon of iconoclasm. In other words, I asked myself the question, why is it that pictures, sculptures should matter so much to people that they should feel inclined to destroy them? This is not the kind of question which art historians, especially in that late Greenbergian stage, would ask of themselves, because they involved the act of iconoclasm, the act of the desire to destroy images, both historically, Byzantium, the Netherlands, and in our own time, was something which was supposed to be, which obviously is, too involved with the emotions. And most of us come out of the great Kantian tradition in which we believe that the emotions should somehow be detached from our assessment of works of art. So from those early days on, I was always concerned with the emotional dimension of aesthetic responses. If you think, though, of the matter of iconoclasm, you realize that emotions are not only involved, but physical actions are also involved. And so the matter of the relationship between physical responses to works of art and emotional responses to works of art became central to my own concerns. When I wrote The Power of Images in 1989, which was a great compendium of emotional responses, it was very clear to me that one also had to consider the ways in which, for example, when we looked at, this was completely independent of what was to happen with the discussions of the Insula later on, when we looked at an image of disgust or somebody reacting with disgust to a plate of porridge, shall we say, The Bean Eaters by Annibale Carracci, we had a similar feeling of disgust ourselves. I also was very interested in the phenomenon of, as an art historian, I've always insisted that one of the most difficult exercises that you can engage in is to take a class into a museum, because you can't just fall back on historical stuff, you actually have to react to the image. And one of the things which you find yourself doing very often is somehow, either inwardly or externally, emulating the gestures which you see in a picture. You will say, look at that, and you will do this. There's a kind of natural imitative aspect to our responses to works of art. Now, of course, this is something which even then in the 1980s, art historians were rather skeptical about. There were some exceptions. Barbara Stafford will talk about this in a moment. And so this whole matter of our physical reactions to works of art became very important to me. It was also very clear to me that our understanding of works of art had a lot to do with our empathetic responses to them. Now, of course, many of you may know that the great French philosopher Merleau-Ponty wrote about his sense of physical engagement with works of art, and indeed the beholder's ability to replicate not only what was happening in the picture, but even to emulate how she or he imagined the artist herself or himself drawing or creating the work. So the matter of empathy was in the forefront of my thoughts. And then, like everybody else, I happened to be reading Tony Damasio's book, Descartes' Error, in which he talked about the relationship between body and emotion. And at one point in that book, he mentioned, this was quite early on, he mentioned mirror neurons. And as soon as I saw this word mirror neurons, I realized that we had the possibility of understanding at much closer range those feelings that we have when we look at the physical actions of actors within pictures, that we act out as if we act as if we were actually engaged in the same gestures or actions as those whom we see in an image, even if we don't actually execute those actions ourselves. This was the fundamental principle which Vittorio Gallese and his team and his group in Parma had discovered, that when the macaque monkey sees another monkey reaching for an object or reaching to grab a bunch of grapes, the observing monkey, the neurons in the premotor cortex fire as if they would fire if the observing monkey were actually engaged in the same action himself. And so it seemed to me that we had a new understanding of our engagement with the physical aspects of the action that is involved in the protagonists of a work of art. Of course, Vittorio and I have now gone a little further in trying to explore not only our relations with what we see in a picture that is actually executed, but also the implied actions that one may see. For example, the traces of gesture in a Jackson Pollock, in a de Kooning, and so on and so forth. So that's basically how we came together. I should say that I was so excited when I read about mirror neurons that I gave an interview. Somebody asked me about my work in an Italian newspaper in 2001, and I said, I think mirror neurons are the most important tool for the understanding of our responses, our aesthetic responses, and I explained why. And then I got a letter from Vittorio I had never met saying, I'm one of the discoverers of mirror neurons. I immediately picked up the phone, and that was the beginning of our fruitful relationship.
So go ahead.
Shall I
Yes.
just say, perhaps I'll approach this somewhat differently, because I assume this is a very diverse audience, but if one thinks of mimesis, if one goes back to Aristotle, what's interesting, it seems to me, about this mirror neuron work is that it is both historical and in some ways trans-historical. And If we go back to something as basic as the Poetics, for example, Aristotle says that imitation is the first response, that it's the first thing that we do, and it is natural. It's something that comes naturally. And then he makes the very interesting observation, but we have to go beyond it. And he says that there is something beyond the child and the first imitation. There is a kind of adult education and theater. I'm thinking of your next performance. That is theater as a kind of reenactment or re-performance, as it were, situates the adult again and again in experience. And so I just want to put that out there to say that there is maybe a wonderful long cultural beginning out there as well. I'm particularly interested in mirror neurons, both in terms of how it relates also to, I would say, contemporary philosophy movements, because mirror neurons give us the body and the feeling of the body is inhabited instead of just controlled. And there's a lot of contemporary neurophilosophy now that says there is no I there. It speaks only of a kind, I think of people like Daniel Dennett, for example, but if you think about it, it's fundamentally about internalizing another person. In other words, you have both I would say, a first-person sense, but you also have that very elusive second person. It allows you to emulate. And that too has a long tradition. I started out as a 18th. I'm not going to bore you with that, but I'll simply say that if you think of the whole culture of sensibilité, of people like Diderot, if you think of the development of a highly nuanced portraiture, particularly in the I want to say the 18th century is really quite special. People like Greuze, that are interested, or Hogarth, that are interested in pantomimic performance. Again, it's a way of engaging the beholder to internalize and understand action. And I guess one of the things I hope we talk about, because I know you've thought about this, it also raises intention. In other words, it's Aristotle's problem. There's a difference between a first-order imitation, that is, the child sees the world, we see the world, the monkey sees the glass of water, and repeats that gesture. But then there's also the question of understanding and how that comes about through re-performance. And so I'm just going to throw those issues out and say that there's, I think, quite a bit here, and also for if there's anybody interested in distributed or extended cognition, which interests me a great deal, and the revival of some of the people that, if we think of that great period that's sort of been forgotten, the 1960s and 1970s, if we think of work by people like Georgie Kepish, or if we think of the great J.J. Gibson, an environmental theory of affordances, or looking ahead to your own Gerald Edelman, who is coming, and who has a very sophisticated theory of reentry. That is, how is it that we put actions out in the, how is it that the world comes into us as an individual, and things get processed, and those things get put out in the world? It seems to me mirror systems are really quite at the heart of that kind of extended cognition. So I'll just throw that out for the group.
So, I mean, I can see a little bit why this is of interest to art historians, but why is it of interest to an artist?
To an artist? Well, I'm not only an artist. It's one of the hats that I wear. I'm the chair of the Fine Arts Department at the School of Visual Arts. Before that, I was chair of the Art History Department at the School of Visual Arts. My book, The Molecular Gaze, Art in the Genetic Age, addresses the ways in which visual knowledge is a field that essentially is opened up by the use of diverse disciplines. So at a time in contemporary art, and that is my area, at a time in contemporary art when things are, one can say, not going as well as they should, the biological sciences are in a golden age. And artists have always been attracted to and have always employed the ideas of their times. Even someone like, for example, the Munch has a there's a relationship between Cajal and Munch in terms of the ways in which new frontiers of visualization techniques really change the way we think about things. And I think that when one talks about pictures, one talks about a certain, not only history of pictures, but a certain contemporary authority of pictures. And that all visual interpretations are not equal. And that these are, whether they're culturally coded, whether they're learned responses, whether they can be manipulated or under surveillance, any ways in which perception can be altered is something that visual artists are interested in, because we are in the business of communication, and response is one of the aspects of that.
It seems to me when you talk about the mirror neurons and you talk about that if I go to take this glass, your mirror neurons are going to go through the same set of firing as my neurons have done. You're talking about a relatively straightforward response. But when you're talking about art and looking at art, you're talking about a much more complex response where people's own fantasies, knowledge, education comes into play. And so how does that get dealt with this? And that's why I'm going to turn to you.
Okay.
Very deftly done.
Well, first of all, an experience from my own life where I suddenly understood something I hadn't understood in myself before. I play the recorder and Baroque music, and I take lessons with one of my teacher who is obviously much more experienced. And sometimes I'll have the experience that she will play a phrase very differently from the way I've played it. And I listen to it, but without realizing it, I will play it exactly the same way. And so it's without understanding what I'm doing. There's something that seems to happen automatically, completely outside of my awareness. And so I wonder whether in that sense you would think that mirror neurons, because here's the difference between imitation and understanding. That is, I may first imitate exactly the way she's doing the phrase without really having internalized it and without having made it mine. So I think that would be a little example maybe of mirror neuron. Another one that appeals to me is thinking about advertising on TV. What people do to lead children to buy toys or to want foods. I suspect that there's some of that phenomenon that's but now to turn a little bit more serious things. I happened to be reading recently Freud's paper, Moses of Monotheism, and I thought I'd just read one little phrase because it's relevant to tonight's discussion. He talks about the artistic intentions. And he says, in my opinion, what grips us so powerfully can only be the artist's intention. I realize that this cannot be merely a matter of intellectual comprehension. What he aims at as the artist is to awaken in us the same emotional attitude, the same mental constellation as that which in him produce the impetus to create. So I would say, isn't that an interesting idea that in a sense presages what we're talking about?
I think it's interesting, but I don't think it's correct.
Okay. What's wrong with it?
I don't think that one can ever get to the nitty-gritty of an artist's intentions. The intentions may not even be conscious to the artist. And I think one of the bifurcations between the humanities and the sciences is a kind of false categorization about cognition and emotion. I think what happens in a work of art and why one has a gestalt experience with it, because it happens all at once, and it requires both intellect and emotion in order for one to respond to the fullest capacity. Intentionality in art is a very fuzzy area. Particularly as I see my students proceed with different projects, and they then explain to me what they are doing, and I wonder whether they're on Mars or something like that, because there is no correlation between what they think they're doing and what they're doing. The other thing is artists lie. Okay, one of our jobs is to lie. You know, pictures are illusions, they're deceptions. They are intended to create somatic affect, but they don't necessarily have to do so for the good. And I think that the question here of the myth of the artist, or using the artist as sort of the signature for neuroscience, which has been done recently, is again bifurcating the experience of reacting to and making a work of art. I mean, Marcel Duchamp said he stopped making art. Did he stop making art? No. So if you read artist diaries and you read the different kinds of attributions, you will find all sorts of things that are sort of untrue.
You want to respond to criticism of Freudian?
Yes. The issue of intentionality, I couldn't agree with you more, is complicated. And it's very easy to make wild interpretation statements about intentionality. And I think that's something that I've been particularly interested in as a methodological issue. And I think there are ways that can approach it by creating a number of context of the writer, or either way. I couldn't agree with you more that a great writer or a great artist trying to explain his work may not have the fuzziest idea of what he was about to. So that's a real problem. But I want to get back to the issue of the mirror neurons and ask Dave something. I felt a little bit when I was asked to participate in this that I might be like the fox asked to come into the hen coop, because I have real concerns and questions about the applicability of mirror neurons to something as complicated as aesthetic products. And how I would frame my concern would be the following. If you look, let's say, at a very poor photograph, okay, of a man throwing a ball, then if you look at a great photograph of a man throwing a ball, then if you look at a poor painting of a man throwing a ball, and if you look then at a very good painting of a man throwing a ball, I don't think, unless I'm mistaken, that in terms of how far you've gotten with your theory of mirror neurons, that you could help explicate. You could talk about a mechanism that is involved, but when you talk about the reaction of the person to those four different things I've laid out, I haven't read in the literature on mirror neuron at least anything that would help me sort out in a way that is as subtle and as complicated as a viewer response is to, let's say, these four products.
Well, as we would say in Italian, I regard myself as honorary, then pazienza. I mean, after all, you know, the mirror neurons, the discovery was in 1991. Right. Of course, to scientists, this seems like an age ago. To those of us who work in the humanities, it seems like yesterday. And there's work to be done. And in fact, one of the reasons that I've been happy to have this dialogue with Vittorio, and I'm happy to be here this evening, is precisely because of the fact that people involved with art have not, I think, seen the potential of this discovery for the understanding of aesthetic issues. Now, there's several things to be said here. I don't think anyone has claimed that mirror neurons is going to provide the secrets to art. All that we are claiming is that, I mean, this is very difficult. There are some neuroscientists, some people who call themselves neuroaestheticians who try to give the 7 or 8 principles of art. I'm thinking of Samizeki, I'm thinking of V.S. Ramachandran, but
there's a lot of neuroscientific hubris out there.
There's a lot of neuroscientific. But all I think that I would like to say, and then I want to come back to Suzanne's abandoned critique of, if I may, but all I would like to say is that I don't think we can proceed with our aesthetic investigations without understanding some of the basic responses which actually may form a component of the aesthetic response. We are not suggesting that mirror neurons gives the whole aesthetic story, but to deny the matter of inward imitation that may precede what you are calling understanding seems to me to create a lacuna which can now be filled. In other words, it's not a nostrum.
I want to actually leap in here because I think a very important distinction has to be made, and that is the ways in which one has to make a distinction between automaticity, that is autonomous mechanisms, and really understanding those. It's something I think that we don't like to do. We don't like to think that 80% of, or if at least 80% of our responses are somehow driven by spontaneous intrinsic mechanisms. And I think that's extremely important to make a distinction because there's a lot of art that plays on that. Duchamp, for example, plays on that. Surrealists play on that. And one has to understand that not all artwork does the same thing, and you know that. What I think is maybe the next level, because there's not just one mirror neuron system, there are many mirror neuron systems. One has to talk about coordination of those systems, and also maybe the work of higher level consciousness that is actively engaged in coordination. So there are all these mechanisms that are predicated on our automatic responses, and then there are these others, and different kinds of art really appeal to these different things, and I think that really would get things moving along in a very exciting way, and I think that it would get biology and culture deeply back together again.
Yes.
If I may add something, I think here it should be made very clear that we are not dealing with a sort of Skinnerian mechanism, with a fixed, permanent, unalterable coupling between stimulus and response. There is already plenty of evidence showing that the degree and the intensity to which such mirroring mechanisms can be evoked during, for example, observation of different actions, emotions, or sensations is potently driven by the personal experiential history of the individual displaying these responses. There are beautiful studies done on professional dancers, for example, which clearly exemplify that if you are a classic ballet dancer, and if you watch classic ballet with respect to capoeira, your mirror neuron system is more driven by the observation of classic ballet with respect to when you observe steps of capoeira and the other way around. Further, there are studies showing that only professional piano players are capable of activating a motor representation of a scale played on a keyboard without any sound. Non-professional piano players don't. They simply recall what they see on their visual system. There is not an activation of the motor system. So this implies that these mechanisms are highly plastic and are highly influenced by the personal history of the person bearing them, which also implies that a naive eye or an expert eye, an artist eye or a naive eye, when looking at the same artwork, will probably display different responses. And to a certain extent, we believe that we are in a position to measure those differences. And this is one of the things that we are planning to put on our research agenda for the coming years.
Mm.
I think that what Vittorio said is very important, but I just want to get back to what I said at the beginning about patience, because we are at the beginning of these researches, and I wanted to tell Francis, you raised the question of, is there any difference between, let us broadly call them mirror responses to a photograph and a painting and so on and so forth, and you say that your intuitive feeling is that there would be no differences, but in fact I've been doing some experiments with another neuroscientist, not Vittorio, which we've been using transcranial magnetic stimulation, and we found that the motor evoked potentials for muscles that when you observe, this is the realm of automaticity, when you observe a Michelangelo are greater than when you observe a photograph. And we don't know why. But I mean, science proceeds at a slow process. Yeah, presumably the issues of color, and presumably there are also issues of, to bring the discussion round back to your initial passage from Freud, also probably has to do with the conscious or unconscious ability of the artist to convey that particular movement successfully. So in that sense, to awaken in the beholder the same mental constellation is rather a nice way of putting it, as Freud did.
Yeah. Now, I think that the issue of the aesthetic response, first of all, we would have to define what people mean by aesthetic response, because it's a term that's in fact so broad. We may each know what we think we know, but it's something so complicated and it involves so many layers that I'm concerned that there would be a reductive attempt to explain away something. Let me read one little paragraph from Delacroix. And he says, the main source of interest comes from the soul of the artist and flows into the soul of the beholder in an irresistible way. Not that every interesting work strikes all its beholders with equal force, merely because each of them is supposed to possess a soul. Only people gifted with feeling and imagination are capable of being moved. These two faculties are equally indispensable to the beholder and the artist, although in different proportions. Now, why did I read this passage? Because the word soul, which of course is something that a great artist might want to think about, is terribly difficult to break down into something that we can talk about.
But the Delacroix passage also makes something very clear, that we in a way respond to what we notice.
Yes.
And attention, I'd really like to stress the importance of attention. That is, Delacroix in a way is suggesting saliency. Certain things are salient to different people, but what's interesting is that the mechanism of saliency is something that's shared, and I think that that is what that maybe this deeper significance of the mirror neuron work. That the body, I mean, if I go back to the Greek concept of aesthetics, it means sensory knowing. It's knowledge in the body, that the body thinks, which is, of course, the Merleau-Ponty connection as well, the phenomenological connection, which I think fits rather nicely as well. So I just wanted to point that out. It seems to me that there is something in that passage about attention and noticing that is both particular to an individual, but it also speaks to a more general habit of the way in which we seize things from the perceptual stream. Here's being Gibsonian here.
I think there's also another aspect of this which may go back to something about the difference between a photograph and the Michelangelo, is the kinesthetic experience of sculpture in space.
Right.
And the way the body reacts to installation, formatting, etc. And there's many studies being done now with neuroarchitecture as a way to create a dynamic kind of spatial arrangement. But I want to mention two artists' works, two contemporary artists' work. One is Thomas Struth, the photographer, who photographs people standing in front of famous paintings in famous museums. Right. And they mimic, the persons mimic what is being represented. And I'm sure that Thomas would be very surprised to hear about a mirror neuron. That's number one. Number two is Christian Boltanski, who has been able to elicit viewer response to the point of tears, just about, by collecting photographs in old thrift shops, etc., and installing them as memorials that make them appear as if this is a memorial to a Holocaust survivor. None of this is true. These are random photographs that are just gleaned out of thrift shops. And I think that this sort of question of over-determining, in a way, the kinds of actions that are still so subtle with us is a great, exciting, fabulous space to be in. And I think that many artists would be more involved in this if you took sort of the neurology part away.
Well, but the thing is, I actually use, but Suzanne, I'm going to say, I use actually Thomas Struth in my Echo Objects book because it seems to me it speaks to the intuitive level of the mirror neuron. If you look, for example, at, but that gets, I want to put something else on the table, that despised word formalism. If one thinks of morphology, if one thinks of Darcy Thompson, the ways in which not only the natural world, but the ways in which we intuitively mimic formats, in other words, where larger compositions even speak to us, and again, it's a process of internalization. The way in which, for example, the people in Struth's raft, looking at Géricault's raft of the Medusa, actually fan out into instinctively order themselves vis-a-vis an aesthetic order. There's a kind of mimicking system. And that isn't the whole story, but it seems to me it's a really deep bodily intelligence whereby, as Dr. Rizzolatti and Vittorio just said, thank you, that one does it before one understands it. In other words, intuitively you shape yourself to that, and then you interpret it afterwards. So it rises to consciousness afterwards. So I just want to say, because Thomas Struth is actually dear to my heart. So
I would like to briefly bring up the issue of reductionism, because I think there's a sort of paradox here. Who are the real reductionists? I mean, do we really want to reduce human nature, human experiences, and therefore art experiences to a cognitive enterprise solely mediated by our most highly sophisticated cognitive endowments it is only something that only to do with language. That's what we taught us during the last 50 years. Classic cognitive science has produced a dramatic divergence between the domain of experience and the domain of knowledge. I think that neuroscience today, or at least a certain kind of neuroscience, because there are many options out there, can provide new ways of bringing back experience into the debate, not only in aesthetics, but also on the larger issue of social cognition, interpersonal relations. So we are not just pure representational systems. We are embodied creatures. And we should give to the body what pertains to a body, which, in my humble opinion, plays an enormous role in social cognition and therefore in aesthetic as well.
Could you define aesthetics a little bit more, when you use it, because it's a word that is very slippery?
I couldn't begin to define aesthetics, and I don't intend to define aesthetics. Whatever it is that we call aesthetic responses must surely have a component which relates to the matter of embodied simulation, as Vittorio has rightly called it, and as he has just pointed out. This must be a component of our responses to all works that we regard as art. But none of us now know exactly what art is, so I step back. I mean, this is a historical question. This is not a question for neuroscience.
May I quote a very old author, Georg Christoph Lichtenberg.
Yes.
So we are in the second half. Second half of the 18th century. Our body stands in between our soul and the external world, mirroring the effects of both. I think we are trying to investigate this particular aspect here.
Yeah, physiognomics, the whole, one can think of physiognomic theory, which Lichtenberg, of course, challenged. He said you can tell more by the way a person wears his or her hat than you can by facial analysis, and yet it seems to me both are wonderful. He brings action. He brings action into it. But I was very struck by what you said about 50 years of linguistic work, because I'm really struck. What's to me as an imagist, I'm kind of a Ezra Poundian imagist is what I think I am. But anyway, I'm going to identify myself as that because what's so exciting to me is I think all this work that's been done on cognitive linguistics, and it seems to me mirror neurons really opens up the gestural, it opens up mantic, not hermeneutic experience. That is experience that goes to the level of ritual, performance, that is really body-based. And we were speaking a few moments before we joined the roundtable on work by my colleague in psychology, David McNeil, and Susan Golden Meadow on gesture and speech. That is the ways in which gesture is not simply an embroidery on speech, but is actually, if you, experiments have been done that if you tie a person's hands down or you don't permit them to move their hands when they're speaking, the thought is not formed. So that the way in which this inactive process is really central, and it seems to me that too is central to your work. That is this performative dimension, which puts mantics rather than hermeneutics back in the foreground.
And you see that when people talk on the telephone.
Yeah.
They gesture.
Yes, even on the cell phone, walking in the streets, it's quite dangerous to navigate New York streets. I discovered that this afternoon. Right.
If you have somebody throwing a ball,
right,
you're looking at.
Yes.
And the person who's looking at this person throwing the ball is told to do the opposite. How do the two systems work then?
There is an interfering effect, because you have two competing motor representations which get activated simultaneously. Indeed, we carried out several studies to explore to which extent our capacity to process and understand the meaning of a sentence, an action-related sentence, a sentence which describes an action, can benefit of the activation of this mechanism. For example, suppose it's a very simple task, a go-no-go task. You are listening to sentences. Your instructions are that if it is an action-related sentence, you have to press a button. If it is an abstract sentence, you have to refrain from responding. And sentences can describe actions performed by a hand or by a foot. And you might be required to emit the response either by the hand or by pressing a pedal with your foot. So when you are processing an action-related sentence describing an action performed by a foot, your foot response is slower with respect to your hand response. Why? Because while you are processing the sentence, you are simulating the action described by the sentence, and that motor simulation process interferes with the activation of the motor program required to effectively set into motion the very same effector described in the sentence. And the same holds true if you do the experiment by employing transcranial magnetic simulation. So even our processing of concrete words or sentences which describe action implies an activation of the motor system. To which extent this activation is required to understand the meaning of the sentence is something we need to investigate more. So we are not in a position to say that we understand by purely simulating. But certainly it's striking this systematic activation, which, by the way, occurs about 20 milliseconds after the word has been processed by the auditory part of the brain. So it's not that you listen to the sentence, you understanding by activating a putative linguistic specialized module, and then after the understanding process has been achieved, you indulge in a kind of motor imagery. This activation of the motor system is almost immediate. Mm-hmm. So it most likely will, we believe, it plays a role in the understanding process. But we need to do more studies to back up this hypothesis.
When I was raising questions before, David said, you know, have patience. Well, now I'm going to ask him the opposite, because I was asking too complicated questions. Yeah. Open your fantasy. And how do you imagine that if you further study mirror neurons, what additional light or what aspects do you think about the complex aesthetic response in the future, this is your fantasy now, it could help illuminate, clarify?
Well, I think there's one interesting way in which it might, and this relates to a point which Vittorio made earlier on, and I've often thought, you know, look, most of us hold out the dream that some works of art will be accessible to everybody, or to more than those from our own culture. We know from our own experience that we can respond to works of art from other cultures, and we know that we can only respond to works of art within our own culture. I think that perhaps, I mean, I repeat, and I think Vittorio would agree with me, that mirror neurons are not going to provide the solution to every aesthetic problem out there. It reinstates a dimension of aesthetic response which has been absent largely from Western thinking about the art. Barbara will know the exceptions, but most of us, as I said earlier, are brought up in the shadow of Kant, who detached the emotions from art. And to some extent, Freud also did this, because of this need for detaching too direct an engagement with the central aspects of the work of art, and it calls for reflection, as you know. I mean, this is the idea in the West. But so what are the prospects, to get back to your question? I think one interesting prospect would be simply by alerting viewers to the possibilities of understanding gestures, movements within works of art. And I think you could, in a way, sensitize less adept beholders to the possibilities inherent in works of art by suggesting, you know, what not only are the kinds of physical gestures which you respond to, but what kinds of emotions do you associate with those gestures. Now, I should say that what is so interesting is that many of these ideas, of course, have antecedents. There was this great period of German empathy theory at the end of the 19th century, out of which, for example, came A.B. Warburg. And A.B. Warburg, with his notion of the pathos formal, this notion that somehow the agitated drapery that swirled around dancing figures in Renaissance art were the outward expression of inner emotion. These are issues which I think we need to attend to more, and are to some extent illuminated by the discoveries around mirror neurons. I think there is a step that needs to be made between the study of movement and the emotions that issue from them. I mean, this is a question which William James, of course, raised,
That's
and
right.
people have worried about ever since.
See, I would have less problems if you spoke of response to images rather than to respond to art. Because I think there's a big difference, you see. You're talking about responding to certain images, some of which might be art. But if you're going to bring in the word aesthetic, then you're going to have to show me how it relates to something's a work of art rather than just an image. That would be very helpful.
Well, certainly, in aesthetic experience, so when we contemplate a work of art, there has to be a very powerful framing effect. So, in a sense, we are not involved in the stream of life. So we suspend our immersion in the stream of life, and we delimit within our attentional focus a very specific spot on which we concentrate all of our personal attentional involvement. So that already should provide an amplifying factor. So, for example, I would expect that if we look at some apples or bottles, take Suzanne or Morandi, for example, and we show them to participants, and we contrast the activation induced by this observation with the observation of equivalent objects portrayed in a non-artistic picture.
Or a bowl of apples on the table.
Exactly. The expected outcome would be to have an increased activation of the motor system coupled to an enhancement of emotion-related circuit in the case of the work of art with respect to the trivial rendition of the object as such, possibly with a very strong influence played by the degree to which the eye of the beholder is naive or not. So it can be expected a strong modulation of the personal expertise and personal history of the person contemplating that. So we should segregate different categories of viewers and different renditions of the same object. And by doing that, I think we will be probably in a position to move a little step forward.
I'd like to take a crack at your question as well and say that there may be two areas. One would be the role of ambiguity. It seems to me that one of the things that you were describing is the problem if one has, as it were, two competing systems. And it seems to me that art, in many ways, deals. We can think of the tradition of the Vexierbild. We can think of anamorphic images. I mean, I don't want to go the route of V.S. Ramachandran, who has, of course, studied this with considerable, one can say, in too narrow a fashion. But it seems to me what is interesting about cultural productions, and particularly of these sort, is this problem of, which is a great problem, of uncertainty and ambiguity. The other thing that I think paradoxically mirror neuron systems would shed light on are the ways in which certain kinds of art forms defy the system. And I think of montage work, for example, work that refuses to mirror neatly, which means that at some level you have to understand the system. In other words, you have to understand the way in which that system works in order to defy it. Yeah. And it seems to me that, again, if one thinks one can have a great deal of historical specificity, but it seems to me there's also a great stretch. One can think of emblem construction, for example. Again, in my book, I talk a lot about compound images and composites. That kind of construction obviously plays with an intuitive understanding of that it is, as it were, thwarting that mirror process, so that you have both and. So it seems to me I would like to add those two and say that paradoxically I think great things can be expected from the other side as well, by looking at it in terms of how it gets thwarted.
I have a question that was recently raised in a conversation with a curator who was here from London, who was actually doing the Linnaeus exhibition in London this summer in the Museum of Natural History, and we were talking about film, and we were talking about the Louis Buñuel film, in which there is the slice of the eye. And I said, every time I see that, I have the same reaction. And she said to me, you didn't see that. That it was the filmic cut that caused that reaction. And that fits very much into what you're talking about in terms of montage.
Yeah.
But this system must be not that strong a system, because it has to be possible to constantly override it and have the opposite feelings to the feeling that, in other words, you could see somebody have disgust and you not have disgust, or more commonly,
definitely.
You see somebody eating something that you find disgusting and they're eating it with great relish.
Or I can be happy to see a person I dislike to be in pain.
And you couldn't do psycho. I mean, if what you are saying in terms of the emotions are accurate, because I can see the motor part, I'm not so clear yet about the emotional part. If that were accurate, if it weren't possible to overcome that, one couldn't be a psychoanalyst, because you would be constantly going from one emotion to the other, not knowing where you are.
As I said, we are not dealing with this Skinnerian mechanism. Yeah. So my question is the following. How do I understand the emotional status of someone else? And then how do I react to that understanding? We should, I think, keep those two issues separate. Yeah. Mirror neurons provide an answer to the first part of the problem. So how do I realize how does it feel to be in a given emotional or state? How does it feel to feel pain? How does it feel to be disgusted? How does it feel to feel anger? If we take as a sort of negative evidence what Asperger patients refer, what they talk about is the fact that they cannot directly access the meaning of the expression of a given emotion. They have to apply a theory in order to make sense of what other fellows are experiencing at that very moment, which is exactly what the opposite of what many people claim, that the autistic dimension is due to a lack of theory. It's just the opposite. You need the theory to compensate a lack of direct involvement, direct engagement. And these embodied mechanisms are buying exactly that, in my opinion. So this direct access to the experiential world of the other, which...
Well, it's more a cognitive understanding, not an emotion. Because once you're talking about emotions, in other words, when you say, I understand how you feel when you are sad,
yes.
You are sad, but I'm not sad.
Exactly. But in order to understand how does it feel to be sad, you don't need to apply an hermeneutic strategy. You have a direct link with the emotional state of the other that you may further on become the intentional object of your speculation, of your interpretation, of your analysis. So, you empathize, well, I shouldn't use this word, which is terrible. I mean, it's polysemic. It's always tricky to deal with the word empty. Nevertheless, you directly, intuitively realize the emotional state experienced by the other by means of this simulation-driven direct access to the experiential world of the other. But you can, at that point, start with all the interpretation and cognitive elaboration of the outcome of this direct access. Two different things.
Do you want to say something specific that is on your mind, or shall I go to the audience? Yeah. Have you said everything you were going to say? Go ahead.
My name is Larry Cutler. Retired. Well, for me, after this, neurons are here to stay. You mentioned about throwing the ball. And I played some ball. And when I started, I would imitate whom I watched. Snuffy Sternweiss. I loved Joe DiMaggio. Even tried to imitate him, which was not right for me. After a period of time, I wasn't just imitating. My own style developed and became my style, which was pretty good. Now, I think everybody does that. Everybody who has anything to do with sports, for example, which is an art, in a sense, they imitate, and I love that word, intent. That we have the intent to what, you know, as Alex Rodriguez hits that home run, or whatever he does, we have that same intent, and we are feeling the same way, you know? And it doesn't only go for sports. I mean, say poetry, for example. If I did a little poetry, and if I hear Hardy, or, you know, some of the things I did, I can imitate it, or I can, with the mirror neurons or whatever it is, I am feeling it, I am understanding it, whether I'm as good. Now, the only thing is, and then I better end because you can't do this too long. It takes work with art. Say it's literature. Well, if you're going to understand it and really develop your neurons on it, I mean, you have to do a lot of work. I mean, Bleak House is not easy. Nope. You know, so you have to do a lot of work to get something out of it so that you have a new neurons, whatever it might be. But they're here to stay as far as I'm concerned, and they're there. There's no doubt about it.
Lois, you have to go to the microphone.
I have a vote of confidence.
You do.
Chance favors.
I'd just like to ask David Freedberg to say, Lois Oppenheim, I'd like to ask David Freedberg to say something more about the trace of a gesture in Pollock and the response of the viewer in the context of mirror neuron systems, the response of the viewer to image-less works of art. I'm thinking in particular of something like the monochromatic works of Yves Klein, or the Franz Klein or Motherwell, which is not image-less, but of course is a particular kind of image. And if you could say something about how the mirror neuron system is...
Well, this is really, I mean, the experiments are really Vittorio's domain, but our claim is that you have an understanding of the action that produced the cut, or the action that produced the I was going to say the stroke in how did he do it? The splashes of paint of Jackson Pollock, the directed splashes of paint.
I can see it with the Pollock, but I'd be less ready to say that it's so evident in a work of somebody like Yves Klein.
Well, we were talking about this just last night. You can't see the gesture in Yves Klein or even in Mark Rothko, for example. Rothko is a very
Right,
difficult
yes, of
case.
course.
So this is one of the possibilities that we're now contemplating, because I think most of us would agree that you don't feel especially agitated when you look at a Yves Klein or at a Mark, shall we say, especially the kinds of Rothkos you find in the Seagram murals or in the Rothko Chapel. Why these pictures have this kind of serene effect on the beholders is something that we need to explore. But it may have something to do with the absence of the signs of action on those.
And the open text, so to speak, that allows one's own fantasies. It's very stimulating of the viewer's fantasy. I don't know whether that...
Well, I think there were probably two stages here if you were going to sort of, I mean, on the one hand, we have been interested in, you know, a premotor cortex and motor cortex and the activation of neurons in the premotor and motor cortex, which presumably would be lower. I mean, we haven't done these experiments, but you could do these experiments in the case of those large blank fields, which, as I say, I mean, you know, one of the interesting things about the mirror research is people say to me, so what, I knew that all along, but we now have a kind of neural substrate for those feelings which we intuited about pictures. We have a neural substrate for our responses to those baseball hitters or the cricket players. I can tell you a story about cricket in a moment. But we don't have, and I think we may therefore also have some kind of explanation for those feelings of serenity and calm in the case of the Yves Klein. And now, on the, shall we say, Yves Klein or Ad Reinhardt. The matter of fantasy is, of course, a whole other question, because this is really a cognitive response. So I think, you know, there you would have to do a whole different set of tests, isn't it? You know, what ideas come into your mind? I mean, these are so individualized that I myself would find some difficulty in devising experiments. I think, actually, to get back to Francis's question, you know, the test for any consideration, any future aesthetics, as it were, to crib a title, test for any future aesthetic must surely be the ways in which those parts of the brain that are involved in cognitive evaluation of automatic responses come into play when we look at a work of art. I mean, that's really going to be the interesting project.
May I just add one thing? I want to talk for a second about Welder's principle of multiple function.
Sorry, can I just say, I don't know whether, you know, that was enough to begin with.
That was a good beginning.
Okay.
Yeah. Welder talked about the ego as the seat of the sort of the synthetic part of the person, and that each act solves a number of problems, and that the more the scope of problems is solved, the more satisfying it is. And he said in his paper, though some people might disagree, that the act of love is the act that is the most perfect in solving as many problems. Now, if you look at a work of great art, and I like the idea of ambiguity because I think it's central, our response to a great work of art is going to be more complicated because of the role of ambiguity. Now, what would be very fascinating from the point of view of the motor neurons, if you could show in some fashion that the response to a great work of art is more complicated neurologically than it is in a, not now you we'll have to agree on their certain masterpieces or something by Velázquez. And if we could show some differences then in neuronal, then we might have at least a point of entry into thinking about the complexity of the human brain and how it responds to art.
And difference in individual responses. David Olds is next. And then you want to go? Yeah. Okay.
So, a wonderful discussion.
You identify?
What? David Olds. It seems that the mirror neuron discovery has been a major plank in the simulationist model of the mind and how it works, particularly the perceptual systems. And there have been other battles that in other parts of the brain, for instance, with the perception of form and shape and size. Kosselin at Harvard has made it pretty clear that we have analogical phenomena in our visual cortex. In other words, even if I imagine an elephant 10 feet away or an elephant 50 feet away, it's going to take up a different amount of my visual cortex, so that it's, in their view, a depictive model of mind, as opposed to Zenon Pilishin, who has a computational coding system of perception. And I'm wondering then, does the brain do everything in a simulationist way? And if so, if we think that, then we might push it into other areas. And I was wondering if things like mathematics and color, can that be done in a simulationist way?
Who wants to answer?
I'm just starting from the last part of your question about numbers. We have a paper that just appeared in the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience. It's again a TMS experiment, transcranial magnetic stimulation. Very simple task. Participants are looking at the computer screen where numbers appears. Numbers between 1 and 4 or between 6 and 9. And all they have to do is to say odd or even. While they are doing that, we are stimulating the part of the motor cortex which maps the movements of the hand, of the finger of the hands. And it turned out that when subjects were processing number from 1 to 4, but not when processing number from 6 to 9, there was a strong facilitatory effect on the muscle of the right hand. All our participants were right-handed. We haven't done yet the experiment on left-handed participants. So, which implies that when you are not solving a math problem, because you only have to determine whether a 3 is odd or even, nevertheless, you are engaged in a motor simulation which recovers from your past experience, most probably the way you learn to count, which in our Western society basically using the fingers of your right hand. So this is one example. Do we carry out all of our cognitive activities by simply using simulation routines? I don't think so. This is only one part. Probably the part which explains what of our cognitive world is more relevant in building our experiential insight into the experience. What does it mean to be a human being? What does it mean to experience pain, love, hatred, performing a particular action in order to accomplish a particular intention, and so on. The point is that we still know very little. Don't trust Handbook of Neuroscience. If you read the Handbook of Neuroscience, it's okay. Form is here, color is there, shape is there. I mean, it's an oversimplified version. Take, for example, color. Many people in this room take for granted that color is analyzed by a modular system, area V4. If you ask people recording neurons from there, they will tell you that barely 20%, no more than 20% of the neuron recorded from area V4 actually code neurons. Another mystery, our visual system is organized in such a way that the axons of the neurons which receive their input from the rods and cones, ganglion cells, these axons form the optic nerve, the optic tract, and then project to the lateral geniculate body, which is the thalamic nucleus specialized to process visual information. The lateral geniculate body projects in turn to V1, the primary visual cortex. Well, there are far more connections back from V1 to the lateral geniculate body than there are connections from the geniculate body to V1. What is the functional role of this backward connection? We simply don't know. I mean, the decade of the brain was a highly optimistic idea. So probably, I don't know, if anyone entertained the idea that in 10 years people were going to solve the mysteries of the brain, well, within a couple of centuries at the very least.
May I just say one thing at the macro level and just about the math? There's a very interesting group of mathematicians now who are actually studying the performative dimension of diagrams. That is the way in which diagrammatic formulas, things like Feynman's diagrams, but not just those, are actually performatives, and that these are operational images. So I just wanted to say at the macro level, there is really an instantiation of what you're also saying going on at the neural level. I could say more about color, but I'll park it. Thanks.
In a sense, PowerPoint, when giving classes, can be a disaster. I mean, when I had to teach for the first time the compliance curve of the chest-lung system, I realized afterward that I became perhaps capable to have my students understand what was going on by drawing the function manually with the good old chalk on the blackboard, because you construct literally the function, and you have a motor resonance which most likely is not so powerful when you simply have this snapshot-like projection of a slide. So Bill Gates probably would be happy to listen to this, but to the extent that we can use digital tools in an interactive way, so we could have people learning math function by using their mouse, so we have a digital version of the chalk. That seems to help. And I talk to people who are teaching math at the university, and they are exploring this more interactive way of teaching mathematics to graduate students, even graduate students.
I think he touched. You touched on.
Did you say your name?
Steve Birnbach.
You are what your major is?
I've worked with people in various ways.
Speaking of ambiguity.
And that's a good point. I think that there are two things on my mind, and one is grappling with how we even converse with one another, and where we're at any given moment in terms of being able to converse meaningfully with one another, and the level in terms of the neurons of that. I think was just raised, which was the experiments that haven't been done. The whole thing about mirror neurons and imitation suggests a series of experiments possibly in which developmentally one would follow infants and children, if that's possible in your science, to see what happens. And in that context also, one of the neuroscientists who was at a previous panel here with a lot of agreement made reference to the Time magazine article in January. And
who was it?
I forget which person said it, but it was brought up that one of the problems with that type of media discussion is the tendency to abstract or to over-define.
Sure.
And what gets left out is that all of this is always a dynamic process. And so you have, on one level, a series of experiments having to do with what happens when a child is imitating, and then later on, both in individual development and in cultural development, what the interactions with other neurons are that are developed, and the significance of any of that to the kinds of issues we're dealing with, which get very complicated. Art, love, truth. and truth was, you mentioned truth earlier, and in terms of intention, if you were to ask the artist. But I think we have to somehow take a new step back in a relationship to how we approach things. Because if we're using an old language that bifurcates everything, mind, body, language, this, that, it doesn't seem to map what's happening in terms of what we're talking about. Right? In other words, there's a level of experience. The artist often speaks about being a vehicle. You know, well, we can spiritualize that and say, you know, some divine thing is moving through you, or we can maybe look at it in terms of neuroscience, you know, and saying that there's another level of functioning and there's an interactive dynamic there that's very complex that the artist has, you know, with that. And so the artist, if asked, says, I'm just a vehicle. You know, is he lying? Is he not telling the truth? Or if he does the reverse and thinks he knows and gives you a statement of intention, right. You know, is he being dishonest, or is he confused, or, you know, none of that really seems to fit, you know, a contemporary view of what we're living through as we discover all this. So it seems one of the problems of all these discussions always is that we're in time. And how many years, you said more than 10 before the experiments could be done to show the complexity. I guess as a question, what I'm getting to, at least on one level, is what kinds of possibilities or difficulties are we faced with in bringing this to on a scientific level, you know, to a meaningful discussion in terms of, you know, what needs to be found, so that our talking about it is equal to the complexity of what we're finding out. Does that make any sense?
Well, we think, at the very least, that we are progressing step by step. So every time we gain some sort of empirical evidence, this empirical evidence triggers new hypotheses. These new hypotheses, in turn, trigger new experiments. So it's like raising the stakes slowly but steadily every time. So when the evidence is telling that you're wrong, then you have to revise your hypothesis. That's what we are doing. That's what most scientists do. Our empirical problem is to understand where are we going to stop. I mean, not in doing science, that will never end. I mean, that's so enjoyable doing research. So hopefully I will continue for many years. No, the point is, how far can we go? What is the real explanatory role of this mechanism? And how eventually, when one realizes that these mechanisms are not the key to explain complex cognitive aspect of behavior, how these more direct, low-level mechanisms do relate to more cognitively speaking sophisticated mechanisms. That, I think, is one of the key issues we are asked to, probably not to solve, but to address with the future research.
One question that relates to something that Barbara mentioned before, and that was when you brought in the question of mimesis, and also Auerbach, I guess, this famous book on mimesis, is that you created a timeline, kind of the first experiments when we were at the macaque monkeys, when you discovered the mirror neurons.
By the way, the ice cream story in the time is not true.
But you don't eat an ice cream. Is there not some kind of an anomaly here in the fact that mimesis within the timeline of human development was actually a revolutionary activity? In other words, you posited this kind of mimetic activity going on in animals, but within human life itself, wasn't the advent of mimesis and a revolutionary activity, the ability to embody the human being as an image? Like, that's the significance of the primitive, the cave painting, for instance.
Could I say something about this? Because before you raised this question, I was going to say I think what would help a great deal is actually taking a look, as you obviously have, at developmental psychology, but also the enormous amount of work now on prehistory, enormous amount of work on cognitive archaeology, cognitive anthropology, and also, actually, curiously, on our own faculty, as I'm going to mention a rather beleaguered figure, somebody like Bruce Lahn, but who speaks of the Paleolithic revolution as well. And one can ask, in what ways did this fit really within an evolutionary schema? I mean, I think somebody like Edelman, for example, would offer a kind of support to answer that question. I think that you were raising. So the ways in which it really speaks to other areas, I think. it
My
kind of
name is
fleshes,
Chris
gives it
Kale.
context.
And I have an observation and a question. And you had asked my background. I grew up in the art world. All my family were artists, and I visit most of the great museums of the world. I personally have a tremendous emotional response to art, and I collect it. And when I see something on the wall of my house, it just enlivens me with power. When talked about Rothko and a number of the other artists you've mentioned, which do not have specific form but have strong color.
Yes.
And want to make the observation, the power of color is
Yes.
not fully understood. My wife on the wall, she's a lawyer, I created 2 pieces of artwork, and one was very strong red color, and when she feels lackadaisical, non-power, she can look at that and actually give us a power response into her. But when she's very hyper, I have one next to it, which is very blue and light greens, it tends to relax her. And the power of the color has a tremendous response, and I think that's separate from form and separate from an emotional response we may get from mere neurons. And therefore, what I'm saying is all the elements are so complicated that they are not easily segmented. Some people are not visually oriented and do not have a strong response to art. Others may have a background in liking one type thing, and therefore the more they will mirror what they see, which will give a mirror back to themselves. And therefore, how we are oriented emotionally and aesthetically reflects how a piece of work can come back to us to a certain extent. And therefore, a lot of people may not be able to respond to a certain form of art because they do not have any education or appreciation for it. My question is, have you done any research in mirror neurons without actually any way of seeing or responding? Let's say one person who has his eyes closed, but the person next to him has a strong emotional response and anger or fear or sadness. Have you done any response to see if the other person picks up without any?
No.
Okay. And it'll be very interesting to see if that happens too, because that may be a component we can pick up. One of my hobbies is martial arts, and the ability of one person to be able to pick up on non-visual aspects of what's happening in the environment has been documented many, many times. There's an old story of a famous sword teacher who was once meditating under a tree in Japan. One of his students was observing him and said, "Master is so controlled, and so his eyes are closed. He's very vulnerable." And he noticed that the master stood up and looked around and closed his eyes again. Later the master said, "It was very interesting. I was meditating and suddenly I felt a threat." And the student said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Master, that was me because I had thought you were vulnerable." So the ability sometimes to pick up emotional situations from another person, I don't know if that would be the mechanism, but it may be something which is involved. Thank you very much.
Rebecca, you have?
Yes, hi. My name is Rebecca Allen. I'm a painter. And I was very interested in the conversation earlier on that had to do with gesture, and many of you used the word gesture in relation to painting. Barbara talked about the paintings of Greuze and Hogarth and the recognition on the part of the painter of emotional states and the ability of the painter to express those through the various elements of the painting. It made me think about the work of Giotto in the Scrovegni Chapel in Padova, and the fact that so many of the beholders of that work in the 13th and 14th centuries were not, as we would think of, literate people in the sense of reading, but were certainly aware of what those images were saying, and understood that the gestures of mourning were embodied in those angels in the Lamentation of Christ and so forth. But I wondered if Suzanne could talk about the exhibition and talk about her work in particular vis-a-vis this idea that in the 13th and 14th centuries we're looking at bodies expressing and embodying gesture, and now we're looking into the brain and into the microscopic world for these kinds of understandings.
Well, I think it's just another data bank in the sense that that the predominance of images and the bombardment of images in our media culture creates a vast range of possibilities. And what I have found so interesting about scientific images is that they have a cultural dimension to them as well, that they don't only function as sort of the residue of an experiment, etc. I mean, what happens many times in science history is science eats its own history, whereas in art that doesn't happen. So that for me to go to the scientific iconography and to repurpose it and look at it in terms of its value as a cultural artifact, that brings new information to the fore. And I'll just use these pieces as an example. On the orange wall, what those are scans of Rorschach tests that I converted from two-dimensional ink blots into three-dimensional sculptures. I then took the three-dimensional sculpture and rescanned them back into two-dimensional objects, so that this relationship between 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions, between what seems to be a random ink blot, what seems to be a projective technique, what seems to have an enormous amount of historical and cultural baggage. Everyone knows what a Rorschach test is. In fact, it's become part of the vernacular description of sort of, one can say, more about you as about what you are saying about someone in that way. So with these new technologies, what was apparently looking like an amorphous kind of form as an ink blot, once they became objects, and I'm sorry I don't have any here because we didn't have any place we could really put them, but when you can hold an imaginative projective test in your hand, and it feels as if it's either a body part or a bone or a sea creature, there is this kind of atavistic response to a kind of primal recognition that something's there that you cannot quite decode, but you can recognize. And I think that the Rorschachs, for me, sort of in reading Peter Galston's book, he talks about the Rorschach as being one of the most studied tests ever. In fact, the printers of the Rorschach tests, if it was too humid one day, they wouldn't print it, so that there wouldn't be any sort of extra crinkles or wrinkles, etc. Now, maybe I can ask the psychoanalysts here about the Rorschach test and whether you think that it still has psychological currency, or can, in fact, anything be used as a Rorschach test?
Well, the Rorschach is standardized, so the responses are standardized and tabulated. I don't know enough about them. My wife is the expert on them, but you can't just use anything in their place. You have a question?
Hi, I'm Mark Alfano. I do philosophy. So far, I've only heard about mirror neurons in responses to perception, but not to misperception. So I'm wondering...
Sorry, but not to?
Misperception? So you've talked about, seeing someone throwing a ball, and there's no misrecognition there, no misperception. And I'm curious to know what would happen if someone misperceived a subject throwing a ball? If the mirror neuron system would be set off in the same way or a different way or not at all? And also things like the Kuleshov effect, which is something from film theory. It's basically the following. You have someone's face on the screen, and then there's a cut and you see a coffin, and then the same actor's face. And usually people think, oh, his expression changed. He looks very sad or pensive, but it's actually a still, right? So the face doesn't change at all. And then maybe a baby, and then the face again. He looks very interested. And then soup, and the face again. He looks hungry. And I'm wondering what kind of reactions the mirror neuron system might have to that.
That's a very interesting question, and actually, together with psychiatrists in Rome, we are exactly running that experiment. So we are interested in combining the personality profile of the viewer with the outcome of his observation of the same action played against different backgrounds. So an angry face grasping a spoon, a sad face grasping a spoon, a happy face grasping a spoon. So we want to see to which extent the emotional system can modulate the responsiveness of the motor resonance, of the motor simulation mechanism. And dealing with the first part, also very interesting of your question about misperception, I felt that it could be somehow related to the topic of ambiguity, and to be honest, I have no answer to that question. We don't know.
Just one word on this. The role of projection is what we're talking about. And Arlo has written that our perception of outer reality is not just we perceive outer reality, but outer reality, the way we perceive it, is conditioned by our inner reality. And this is what has been left out of our discussion so far, that is the degree to which our perception is not of something out there, but is really influenced by something inside there, and that adds another layer of complexity.
I would say it the other way around, that it's context. In other words, in how much is this context dependent? How much is our perception context dependent? And there are actually, to answer the philosophy question, unfortunately coming out of areas like neuroeconomics, I say unfortunately, but that's where, I mean, there are now studies of misperception, faking. That's an interesting question. How do you know that an emotion is real or a false emotion? I mean, there are those sorts of, but they are, of course, ambiguous results. Yeah. No. It's just
actually selling kits.
But interesting how one detects the real from the false. I mean, the 18th century was actually quite good at that. I'm thinking there was some very interesting. Lichtenberg was actually quite great on that.
I'm going to take two more questions, there and here.
Yeah.
So, hi. My name is Anirudh Devatya, and I am a cognitive scientist in training, so to speak. So I just wanted
We are all in training.
Life.
Yeah.
I wanted to actually use your example of this sentence and the foot, Dr. Gallese. Use that to try and understand, because that was a great example of how the mirror neurons interfered with the intentional sort of motor program.
Exactly.
And my question was, well, how could we relate this to people who have a profound ability to impact other masses and crowd mentality and sort of mob mentality and the loss of self that is often described by people who commit acts of violence in mobs and then later wake up and sort of have this sense of loss of self and loss of agency. And so I know, I don't know if you can comment on that. But
it's a very interesting question, but which would by itself deserve another roundtable. And of course, this is too far away from the current level being addressed by our benchmark. So Sorry.
Okay, last question.
My name is Mark Hogan. I'm a stock trader. My question is, what role, if any, do mirror neurons play in the phenomenon of phantom limbs?
Phenomenon of what?
Phantom limbs.
Phantom limbs. Well, you create an illusion by seeing in motion a limb that you do not have, because the location at which the limb occurs is compatible with the location you would have if you still had. So most likely these activate a motor representation which is still active. And indeed, there's a group of psychiatrists in Zurich who have been able to show that a congenitally limb deficient lady, a lady who unfortunately was born without upper and lower limbs, but still was capable of entertaining phantom limb sensation, they brain scanned her while she was entertaining this phantom limb sensation, and interestingly, what they observed that during the phantom limb sensation, what was active within her motor system was not the primary motor cortex, so the part of the motor system which issued the command to the motor spinal neuron, which in turn activate the muscles, but within the premotor cortex, so within part of the mirror system. So the idea is that some of this motor representation might be hardwired, though fully plastic and exposed to the role that your own motor skill, personal history, as we were talking about before. The idea is that you don't need to have a movable limb to have a motor representation of an action that could be in principle entertained. And most likely the phantom limb effect described by Ramachandran, which by the way is a very powerful effect. I did the experiment myself. I'm not luckily enough limb deficient, but I have a strange asymmetry in my capability of moving my toes. So I can do it with my right foot, but I can't do it. So while on holidays, just to relax, I put a couple of mirrors in the way prescribed by Dr. Ramachandran. After some exercise, I was looking at my left foot as if it were my right one, so I could see it moving, and after doing it several times, I realized that I could begin moving my toes. So it's really powerful.
Okay, thank you very much.